Welcome, bienvenue aujourd'hui to everyone joining. I am Laura Schnurr, Director of Community Climate Transitions here at Tamarack Institute, and I'm pleased to be co-hosting today's session alongside our partner organizations, Climate Caucus, Climate Reality Project Canada, Clean Air Partnership, and David Suzuki Foundation. So I am calling in from the UK today, but Tamarack operates primarily on Turtle Island, which is home to diverse Indigenous communities that have been stewarding these lands since time immemorial. When I think about how this topic connects to our commitment to advance reconciliation, I'm reminded of the State of Climate Action in Canadian Municipalities report that came out earlier this year. Here's a snapshot from the report. One of the findings was that of the 140 municipalities surveyed, fewer than 14% either empowered, collaborated with, or involved local Indigenous rights holders in their local climate action planning. Another 14%, just under 14%, informed those groups, and 19% consulted with them. So the majority, 53%, did not engage at all. So as I think about why we are so much stronger on local climate action planning than on implementation, which was a key finding of this report and actually in part spurred the idea for the partners to focus this webinar series on this topic, I wonder whether part of the answer is that we are, for the most part, failing to collaborate with or even engage Indigenous communities that have so much to contribute to this work. The topic today, as mentioned, we're diving into this, this issue of moving from planning to implementation. That's the 4-part webinar series that we're exploring, and we started that in September, and we're running it till January. And in September, we dove into social barriers. Then last month, we looked at technical barriers. And next month, we'll be looking at financial barriers. And this month's topic dives into some of the political and institutional barriers to local climate action. We have 3 fantastic speakers joining us today for the conversation. So brief introductions to them. We have Julius Lindsay, Director of Sustainable Communities with David Suzuki Foundation, and previously led climate action planning programs and policies in Mississauga and Richmond Hill in Ontario. We have Brian Montgomery, who is Climate Action and Resiliency Advisor with City of Maple Ridge, and has previously worked in a number of different jurisdictions in Ontario, Yukon, and BC on climate and related issues. And we have Natasha Winters, Manager of Climate Governance, Environment, and Climate Change, Halifax Regional Municipality. And she's working on implementing an organizational climate governance model and driving forward Halifax, which is Halifax Local Climate Action Plan. So very excited to be in conversation with each of them. And those were very brief versions of the bios. So what I'm going to do is pop in the chat for everyone their full bios, so you can see a little more about their background, and I'm sure they'll be speaking to not just their current roles and experience in their responses, but really drawing on the diverse backgrounds that they each have. So we'll do that in a moment, but I'm gonna actually kick things off with a first question. And thank you, I'm just catching up on the chat. Thank you everyone for taking the time to introduce yourselves. It's great to see where folks are coming from today. And please do keep those coming. So you can keep contributing as we get going. And in the meantime, I'm going to kick us off with the first question, which is, what political and institutional barriers have you experienced in your local climate work, or have you seen in communities you work with? So maybe I'll start out west, Brian, with you, and then I'll turn to Natasha and to Julius. So why don't you kick us off?
Oh, great. Start with the West. Okay, so the first thing I think, one barrier I think we've had consistently in the series has been this perception of the cycle, right? It is the environment and the economy. And I think there's a perception of people that go, well, when the economy is good, we can do things for the environment because things are good. And then when the economy goes bad, no, the environment is off the table. And yet, when we have these discussions around economic and environment, we also completely ignore the social demographic perspectives of this one. And that's embedded in all these pieces. So what I try to remind people is the economy, it could be good, it could be bad, but the environment and the social demographics both influence and are influenced by how we actually address the economy aspect. And I think one of the barriers I find is, we can try and come up with metrics for like cost of an infrastructural piece. There's some fantastic metrics out there around the cost of adaptation to prevent climate risk, but it's not embedded really well in budgets themselves for a lot of municipalities. And trying to explain sometimes to a finance person who's been trained on these things as an externality, or to come up with a price to them, they kind of look at you going, well, how do I fit that in? And then you're now reaching the other barrier, which is barriers of language and knowledge and professionalism, which I always find interesting. For me, I will admit I'm not under anybody's under terminology and stuff like that. My professionalism is based on experience and my knowledge of working for various municipalities and across Canada. But if you ask me, do I have a certificate in anything from planning to engineering, the answer, or public health, the answer is no. But I have worked in all those departments. So I do have an ability to speak a common language. So one of the common languages I found, and this is very simplistic, but planners versus engineers when it comes to language. So climate mitigation is an interesting perspective. For us as a climate planner, we look at it as reductions of greenhouse gases. But for an engineer that has to deal with risks, it's actually mitigating against those risks. So you have to find the common language for them to understand. If I'm in a room with planners that want to do land use planning, but I also have engineers that want to do infrastructural planning, the two have to speak a common language. When I talk about adaptation, I may lose the engineers and I'll definitely lose the climate planners, because to them it's emission reductions is simple to understand. What is mitigation? And so I'm usually that language translator between the two. And it takes a couple of meetings, but once we've got that sort of level, they start understanding how each other thinks in terms of their different perspectives and how they can work with each other. Those are kind of like, yeah, I don't want to go into the whole list. I'm going to let Natasha and Julius come up with more, but I'm sure based on what they're going to have to say, I'm probably going to have a bit more barriers to talk about.
Yeah, thanks for raising that issue of translation. And it reminds me of a couple sessions ago when we had social barriers, and we spoke a bit about climate communications and some of those pieces, but didn't get into that translator role specifically. So that's really an interesting one. How about you, Natasha?
You're right in that I'm going to echo a lot of what Brian said there, because I think in the context, we all work with the same challenges and barriers. And I don't know that a lot of what we experience as institutionalized barriers, and certainly working as municipal governments, it's very similar, the challenges that we're seeing, which is both a benefit because we can share best practices, but also a hindrance because who's going to actually figure it out and how do we tackle all of those things. So absolutely, that sort of link right now, this common theme around affordability and climate action as being as seen as a nice to do. So when the economy is good and there's money to be able to do the work, then it's great. And then when the economy is tougher and affordability is at a crunch, people tend to look at climate action as something that can be removed or isn't as deeply embedded in the budget. So I echo that comment around budgeting. We're thankfully, we have adopted a climate action tax, which we can talk about in future questions, as a way to safeguard some of our climate work, and certainly helps fund a lot of our work. But in the beginning, it was a big barrier, and we still see it as a barrier in terms of having the work embedded in strategic planning. So not just in the short-term operational plans or even in the long-term 3 to 5 year plans, but also deeply embedded in the strategic plan and the strategic deliverables of the organization. When I think specifically about the barriers that my team focuses on, it's really about systems change and about the mental models that people have related to climate action. And so, time and time again, when we dig deeper to what's preventing climate action or what's preventing people from seeing themselves in the work and the barriers to getting the work really mainstreamed across the organization, is their ability to see themselves in the work. So again, to Brian's point, a lot of what we do is translation, and we speak it into their work or show them their, you know, their purpose of um, the prioritization of them being inside the work. And so our team tends to look at it from a systems change perspective, that it's really influenced by the behaviors and the adoption of each individual person. You know, we can have all the science in the world, but I think Gus Speth once said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, scientists planned for all of the data and we knew what climate change was going to look like for a 30-year period, but what we didn't account for was human behavior and apathy and greed and individualism, and science can't solve that. So I think a big part of what we do in climate action is thinking about people and individual adoption. So those are some of the barriers that we really see is in integrating our work.
Yeah, great points from you both. And so many of the municipalities in our network here at Tamarack, there's maybe one person or a couple people working on climate within a municipality. And yeah, that's not enough, right? As you said, you really need to embed it in the system and ensure that you're tapping into all those different divisions and individuals and key assets. So really great points. And Julius, I know you've worked in multiple municipalities yourself, and now you're working to support municipalities across the country in their local planning. So wondering from that kind of bird's eye view across the country a bit, how you're seeing this.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that that translation piece, because I think an interesting part of that translation piece that everybody's talked about is about folks talking to each other and talking the same language. And so, like, you know, Brian mentioned engineers and planners. Like, if they're talking to each other, they need to make sure that when they agree on something, they're actually agreeing on the same thing and they're not agreeing on separate things, because that they each have their own specific languages to their profession. And so I think beyond like making people see themselves in this work, there's a piece around translating between departments, and particularly in the municipal context of siloization and bureaucracy. It's important to make sure that people are speaking a shared language. I think another thing that I wanted to talk about was the and I don't know how to put it, but I think looking at this from a strategic level, like Natasha said, systems change. And I think that can be challenging in a lot of municipal contexts. I often say that, you know, city manager now is the person who was cleaning the pool 30 years ago. And so they came up through a very operational, very like tactical way of being trained, the way of leadership, the way of leading an organization. And so these kinds of like systemic, strategic planning work, it can be quite foreign for folks, particularly in leadership, who came up from an operational perspective. And so getting them to think that way and then getting them to take action that way can be quite challenging, and is, at least in my career, has been a significant barrier. And then I think the third one that I wanted to talk about is the political barrier, and it aligns with that. It aligns with that internal sort of operational barrier, because there's, you know, particularly at the local level, you have many councillors and mayors who are thinking very thinking about their ward and thinking about the you know, they're thinking about the placement of the garbage can in that park in their ward, and they're not thinking systemically, or they're not thinking strategically. They're interested in, like, you know, what are those things that particular constituent is complaining about, how can they be fixed? You know, they're thinking about the operational level. And so getting them again to think long term, to think strategically, to think about solving climate action as something that happens across the municipality is not something, it's not typical to the way they think about their work, typical to the way they think about how municipalities address these challenges. And so there's something really need to be said about thinking community level, thinking across the city, thinking across departments and how those departments can work together, that is really a part of how we address this work, and getting folks to think on that level and then take action on that level and budget on that level is a shift in the way that a lot of folks have done this work for a very long time. And that goes to the last point that I'll make, is around institutional inertia. And again, if that person is the person who was cleaning the pool 30 years ago, they're now the city manager, they have seen things done in one particular way for 30 years. And and here come these folks saying, you need to think differently, you need to challenge this, or you need to do this differently. And that sounds like more complication and more cost. And oftentimes it's neither of those things. It's a simplification and probably no cost, but that is what it sounds like. That is what it feels like. And so overcoming that inertia of like anything different than the way we've done it for the past 30 years is more cost and more complication, is an important barrier to overcome.
Thanks, Julius. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear each of you speak about systems change in different ways. And it's making me think about the water of systems change framework that we refer to often here at Tamarack, both internally, the way we think about our work, and with work we do with communities. And I just popped it in the chats if anyone's interested and not familiar with this, the 6 conditions of systems change: policies, practices, resource flows. That's sort of the explicit structural change level. Relationships and connections, power dynamics. That's the relational change level, that's semi-explicit. And then mental models that you spoke about, like how do we transform those? That's a transformative change piece that's really implicit and often can be a catalyst for changes at these other levels, and change flows in multiple directions here. But I feel like this is a type of framework that can help overcome some of those barriers that that you've spoken to. So I'm keen to hear, now that we've identified a set of different barriers that you've seen or experienced, I'm wondering if there are some stories and examples that you could tell from either municipalities you're with today or have been with in the past or are working with, around how some of these challenges can be overcome and have been overcome, or could be in theory, and opportunities you see there. So perhaps Natasha, I'll start with you first this time.
Sure. Yeah, I think, as we've just heard, there's a lot that prevents climate action. There's a lot of things that are challenging. And, to Julius's point, systems change or climate action, they're both new in relative terms to the work that governments do or municipalities do, in that they aren't these deeply embedded, sort of very operational type focus areas or outputs that we're used to doing. So a lot of people who are doing climate work or climate action are really taking on and having to kind of translate this new work, or really spending a lot of time selling the benefits and the virtues of it across the organization. And so at HRM, we aren't immune to that. Thankfully, we passed our climate plan unanimously in 2020, and we had some very good political support for that in our previous mayor. And that really opened a lot of doors. But we got to the point in 2023 where we were seeing that despite having very clearly defined 46 actions in our climate plan, I will say it's an ambitious climate plan. It is built on science and based on science. So, it wasn't built on what we think we can do. It was built on what science tells us we must do. And so they are ambitious targets. That being said, the targets are defined and they're assigned priority across the organization. So our public works department knows what they're responsible for, our finance department, et cetera. That being said, when we were trying to measure what we could in terms of progress, we weren't seeing adoption and we weren't seeing uptake. And when we started to dig in a little bit more, we were finding that it was a mixed bag. One, over prioritizing operations, not understanding the work, saturated with priorities. Too many priorities means no priorities. And so my team was really crafted around how can we put a spotlight on this work and help to mainstream it across the organization. And the tool that we chose is a governance model, essentially. And it's a 4-tiered model with top-down direction and executive sponsorship through our CAO, along with a sort of like strategic team that really looks at the big picture and understands sort of those big organizational challenges, what's preventing us. We know siloing across the organization is a challenge, those types of things. Then we have 7 working groups that were really formed around the 7 key areas that if we can make progress, so the key areas in our plan, if we can make progress on these areas, we know we will actually be able to move the needle and really make some progress on reducing our emissions, which is really at the heart of our plan. And those were around, our buildings, our transit, nature-based solutions, resilient communities, our critical infrastructure, looking at finance and fleet electrification. So we've pulled together everybody from across the organization purposefully that touches that work or that is responsible for that work, not just within environment and climate change, but also across the organization operationally. We bring them together. We facilitate the sessions based on a systems change and change management approach. So we are starting, it's dual purpose in that we're introducing this new type and way of thinking across the organization, and we're applying it in how we facilitate these meetings and how we, hold them accountable to action and reporting in the organization. And then the bottom layer of that model is a really informal network, which allows people in our organization who perhaps their work doesn't necessarily tie in with any of the working groups or directly related to our climate plan, but who are environmentally minded, who are climate activists in their own way. And it allows them to come together through these informal groups. And what we're hoping is that ideation comes out of those groups, just like the working groups, that can feed up to opportunities for our organization. So it's really a top-down and bottom-up to help everybody see themselves in the work. So we're 9 months into this governance model. We built it on a theory, and we're integrating philosophies like failing forward, deeply, embedded in this mental models, and moving that sort of relational piece forward and people seeing themselves in the work. And we're making really good progress in a lot of great areas, but we are also uncovering some really institutionalized barriers, such as siloing across the organization, lack of prioritization, and certainly we're seeing a lack of embedding clear direction in the business unit plans, which is the next thing we need to tackle with our senior leadership. So the benefit to this is that we have a monthly meeting with our CAO and our COO to talk about progress and to talk about some of those big challenges. So we have a direct line to both of them, which is very, very helpful. And although we've just gone through a complete council and mayor change, we believe that the political support for our plan is still very strong. And so that has been the soft power that comes from the politicians, I think is really, really helpful. So we feel like this model has been a success. It has certainly brought together groups. It's created faster action. It's broken down barriers where possible, but it's certainly daylighted some of the bigger challenges that we have as an organization and given them to leadership to consider as we move forward with our business plans. So,
yeah. Beautiful example, and appreciate you taking the time to really unpack how it looks in practice and what you've seen so far.
mm-hmm.
It reminds me a lot of the collective impact model that we use here at Tamarack, and our network, Community Climate Transitions Network, as climate collaboratives really across the country, looking at taking whole community climate action in a similar way with a sort of a backbone structure, a constellation governance sort of model. A steering group, and then those working groups and action groups, and then the wider ecosystem. So a lot of parallels.
Yeah, definitely.
Quick follow-up, was wondering if that last level you spoke about with the informal network, if that goes beyond the municipality, is that right?
The informal network, it's interesting that you say collective impact. So I have a colleague, Sarah Thompson, who is our manager of collective impact, and her work, we kind of divide our work little city, big city. So little city inside the organization, big city, she focuses on community action and that collective impact model. So we've developed both an internal network, which is what feeds into the governance model, which is really focused on inside the organization. And her group really focuses on the Halifax network, which is our external network, which was really born out of her work. She came to be with us as a consultant when we were developing our climate action plan and has since joined us full-time, which we're very pleased about. And, it's about bringing together those community stakeholders and partners. So there is interface, and there are people who are both HRM employees and part of the external network, but we do have them both. And then what we're talking about next is how do we integrate those, and then what cadence, and because there's a lot of benefit to having our employees understand and hear success stories and hear about climate action from community as a motivator, right? So it's all about hearing the stories, seeing themselves in the work, and measuring what you can, which is what my team does, but also telling the story of what you can't, because both things are important. So yeah, we're lucky to have a great deal of support.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that a bit more about how you are approaching that. And both levels are certainly essential here, the internal collaboration and then the external. So, Julius, how about you? Any stories you want to share about where you've seen challenges being overcome?
Yeah, and my example kind of builds off of Natasha's example, because one of the things that I think is so important in overcoming challenges is finding internal allies. And so the example that I can give is one of the municipalities I worked with. I won't give any specifics, but one of the departments I worked that was a part of the development of the plan was pretty reticent, not interested in participating. Thought that everything they were doing was fine and they didn't need to change. And they were pretty challenging to work with until they hired somebody externally into their department, and this person had worked on district energy and all kinds of different energy things out in the world. And so I stopped fighting to try and get them to participate. And that person took up the banner, and they got in line relatively quickly after that, because somebody that they respected was saying, like, this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to do it. And I was fortunate enough in that time, we had a similar governance structure to what Natasha was explaining. And there were a few key folks in that group that I could rely on if I need this banner taken up. They were folks that could take the banner up for me. So it's not me fighting as the one climate person I was at the time trying to fight that battle. These are folks in the departments who are fighting that battle in their departments. And oftentimes it's not a battle, because these are people who are highly respected in their teams and who, when they spoke, their words carried weight. And so I think finding those allies, and oftentimes those are folks who want to be involved, they want to take initiative. They're the internal climate activists, as Natasha said, who want to be involved. And oftentimes departments are happy to let those people be involved, because they're the ones who will take it on and run with it. And but also be realistic about what that department can undertake. And so I think that's a really important part of doing this work, is finding those internal allies. I think the other example that I wanted to give was in another municipality that I worked in. We actually brought folks together to have dialogue and not just talk about what needs to be done, but very structured conversations about what needs to be done, what depends on what are the things that we need to do to make other things happen. So the conversation was really about that pathway of action and pathways of action as opposed to discrete actions, which involved folks to get and made them understand how their actions could inform, enable, or could unlock actions in other parts of the organization. And I remember the one example, we had our innovation person, we had our smart cities person, and we had our public art person in the room together, and sort of started the conversation with a bit of context setting. And they had one of the most interesting conversations about climate action that I had ever seen. I said almost nothing in that conversation. And these are three folks who had never talked about climate change in their work before, but they were having a discussion about climate action and how that would happen in the city. without me really being involved. And I thought, the power of bringing folks together and then having them understand how their work intersected and could enable each other really unlocked really interesting action and really interesting possibilities in the possibility of climate action. And so I think, bringing those conversations together, and especially if you have those key plants in the conversation who know how to move the conversation and who are trusted voices, can really help accelerate how climate action can be sort of built up and then rolled out within the municipal context.
I love that example, and just bringing people together and creating the container for a productive conversation, like the setting. I mean, obviously you did so much to pick the right people and create that context and the trust to enable that, but then you can just step back, right? And like watch the magic happen. So that's great. Brian, how about you?
All right, so Julius triggered a great memory for me, and I agree with what Natasha and Julius are both saying. So your informal network as a professional, but as someone who you want to know how what you're doing links to your community, get out of your office. Go to events that not necessarily are about climate change, but they could be about health. They could be about livability. They could be about bike lanes. Go to those meetings. So when I was working in a former municipality in Ontario, and they're on the call, so I won't even name them, but I would meetings and I would have other staff from that municipality who would be in the back of the room. I would be somewhere in the middle or closer to the front. And I remember coming from some of those meetings, the other staff members coming up to me going, "But you work for the city. Aren't you scared to be here? Someone's going to call you out about something." And I looked at them and said, "Call me out about what? Like, this is what we need to hear, because if we're going to make something resonate with our community that works both internally and externally, and remember, there's a lot of external drivers that drive climate action in a municipality, and it's your community more so than, yeah, I mean, we could also talk about the other levels of government, but it is, right? But you need to connect with what's going on out there, because when you have those conversations about how hard certain tasks might be to implement, you can at least start having that with people to go, "Hey, you know what? We'd like to do this, but there's a cost factor to it. How can we work with you? Because there may be grants that we can't apply to as a city, but as a nonprofit, you can. We can support you on that one, because there's that mutual benefit to the work." Internal allies, for sure. Like, going into other departments right now where I am, we have a corporate energy person, and we get along. Like, I sought them out as soon as they were hired, because I knew from previous history, this is someone I needed to connect with. And they've asked me questions about climate change, because they're learning how GHG metrics works, right? So I can actually embed some of that stuff already in the preliminary work, as opposed to after the fact, and have an energy plan and a climate plan that don't speak in parallel and have it actually work in parallel. So that's where I was saying with the informal network. Champions internally are great. So here's my memory that Julius triggered. I'm in a meeting with a CEO of the municipality. There's a huge staff meeting, and they've introduced a consultant to tell us that this consultant will show us how us corporately will deal with sustainability. 2, 3 public health nurses that I've worked with on climate stuff and livability basically voiced up and told me, "Brian, we've got this," and called out the CEO on, why are we talking about getting a consultant to do sustainability when staff have been doing sustainability for 20+ years with community members and all of that. That changed that conversation. The other way it changed the conversation was letting people know, if you're a community group and all, engage not necessarily just with the leadership, try and get an audience with the CEO, but definitely talk to the staff that you're doing this as well, because a lot of times we as staff can get very sidelined very quickly and flatlined on what we're trying to accomplish when we get pulled into a meeting with a counselor who says, "Hey, I heard from this community group and they're saying we're not doing anything on sustainability. So now I've reached out to a group like FCM or ICLEI, and this is what sustainability is all about." And I'm like, "Whoa, stop." Like, we know this, we're doing this, like, please take a break. But the same with having a meeting with your CEO. I had a CEO that, wasn't exactly on the climate change bandwidth, just because they weren't knowledgeable on it, they weren't comfortable with it. But there was a executive director of a nonprofit community group locally that had a meeting with them, and suddenly I get pulled into the CEO's office because they've had this meeting, and the CEO office is like, CEO was like, oh, hey, I just learned about you, Brian. I keep hearing about this climate change stuff. Like, what are we doing? And then depending on that conversation with your CEO or leadership, always keep a grain of salt as to where it might go. Remember, your staff, you still have to take direction from senior levels, but there are ways where it's like you have to also have to stretch your neck a bit to curtail something that might go easily off the track, because remember, you are considered their expert sometimes on climate change. The other thing that I think I would say, just in terms of how some of these challenges have overcome, shout out to networks. So this is outside of like within a municipality, but networks where municipalities can all actually like meet up with each other and having a conversation about what's challenging them and learning those lessons. And I mean that politely from a, please don't make your meetings about here's a presentation, here's a presentation, here's a presentation. Like fill in the time for people to get to know each other. One of the things in Ontario that I really appreciate, and it is a shout out to folks who may still be around in the municipalities of Ontario, if that informal email network of climate people still exists, use it. It's the quickest way that you could type an email to a large group of people and go, I'm struggling with getting energy efficiency in this type of housing. You will get responses. It saves you a lot of time of going onto websites and trying to figure out what their bylaws, whenever like that. Good group of people quickly got those answers. And that was something that we worked with through the GTA Clean Air Council at the time to say, hey, we love the meetings, but like there's a lot of times we can't meet and we need a quick answer on that. The other thing I think that's interesting that I want to point out that's very unique for British Columbia is because there is the BC Climate Charter, we have a program through our provincial government, and this is where I will say, hey, thank you, BC. Coming from Ontario, could really use this. The local government climate action program and funding stream based on metrics. So remember that you have to do greenhouse gas reduction pieces, but the funding is there to help you get things like staff, like programs. So it's kind of like a grant program, but you have to report back to the province. And the other aspect that I really like from a data measuring point of view is I don't have to scramble and trying to figure out greenhouse gas metrics for things like waste, like buildings. It's there already. I go to the website, I can downscale it to my community. Yes, I agree with other municipalities. There's a little bit more deep diving that we can fact check on some of that stuff. But as a starting point, believe me, I'm far more comfortable with that than having to start from scratch constantly. And then when I worked in Ontario, or even in Northwest Territories when I was there, like even trying to find data was like, forget it. You were basically trying to figure out how to do the metrics on your own, and then struggling with groups that would have control over data sets that you'd be like, hi, I need permission to use that data. And then you're going through well, what's it being used for? How are you reporting it? And so to me, it's like, I would say one of the overcoming barriers right now externally for me is the province of BC doing some of that coordinating effort to it and providing the data is really a game changer. Now, we are at the approach where I was saying that's the mitigation side. The other barrier, of course, is that we're now working on the adaptation side. So we're now integrating that with emergency response, which is very unique and pushing the edge on stuff.
Great. Thanks for that. And there's a few questions coming in, lots of interest in some of the things that have been shared. There's one, Brian, just from Jamie here. What was the name of the email network you just referenced around climate work?
I couldn't tell you. I'm not part of that network now. Reach out through, I couldn't tell you now. Because the person I know that was kind of coordinating it has left that position with that municipality. Reach out, talk to some of the members. If you're a member of the GTA Clean Air Council, poke around. That's all I'm gonna say is poke around. It was very much like, I don't want to use the word exclusive, but it was. We were focusing really on just municipality people and program managers and all that had either climate or energy perspective in their work to be able to do that very quick shout. But it saved a lot of time for a lot of my reports where I'm like, hey, who's working on this and how did you do that? So you could build that informal network outside of the formal meetings that we were having.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jamie's shared some info on Clean Air Council, and Henriette has also shared a resource, an online space with a range of region-wide climate groups in the chat. So there's quite a few questions coming in the Q&A panel. So I'm gonna turn us over there for the next little bit. I have so many more questions for you, but I want to have time for these great questions coming in. So one from Robbie in Regina is related to your comment, Natasha, about having people seeing themselves in the work and their purpose in it, and whether you have specific examples of how you've done that. So I'll turn to you or anyone, any of our speakers, to respond. Any examples of helping people see themselves in this work?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Robbie. And I feel like it's the question I try and answer every single day in my job, really, is like, how can I sell climate work to you today? There are a ton of examples. I'm just trying to think of some from perhaps from the working groups. There are some that are really evident. So for example, like our fleet services, our corporate fleet, I mean, they're part of the EV conversion project and like really see themselves deeply in the work of implementing EVs. But once I introduced sort of a change management roadmap and methodology to complement the project management map, they were like, oh, okay, I guess it's not just me ordering the cars and knowing what their operations are. And now I integrate them into sort of the initial meeting, and they're part of the team that goes in and talks about, why we're doing the work we're doing and why it's important and how it helps move action on the plan. And, they've become sort of an integral part. I can, to Julius's point, I can actually sometimes step back and just let them lead those initial meetings. Whereas in the beginning, I really had to be the person who was in there saying, okay, this is why it's important. We're not just converting our fleet because it's a nice thing to do. This is why we're doing the work, and help us understand any concerns you have about that. And now they actually are on board and they can speak to that, which is great. We also have it really well established with critical infrastructure. So we're fortunate to have some really great people working on some really good climate layering and looking at our critical infrastructure from many lenses, not the least of which is a social lens, which we've never done before. And so there are two pieces of work, one coming out of our emergency management office, who was really just focused on in a emergency situation, these are the things that we need to look at. And it wasn't really taking into consideration the makeup of our communities. And for those of you that don't know Halifax Regional Municipality, it's almost 5,000 square kilometers. It's the size of PEI, and we have a huge diversity in terms of our communities, but also our landscape and regions. Like we have very urban, a lot of suburban, and large portion of our municipality is very rural. So planning for those types of things is very complex. And so we've been able to integrate some of our climate layering with our flood mapping data and looking at it from a social context to be able to really kind of more strategically integrate like the risks to those communities. And so whereas perhaps EMO's scope has been very narrow before about like, this is what we do, right? For preparing for emergencies, we've been able to use climate data to tell more of a story and layer on, the impacts of the people who live there and what their socioeconomic needs are, what the infrastructure looks like, what their flood mapping looks like, their exposure to extreme heat. And so it gives a more fulsome picture, and it's created this beautiful partnership between our two groups. And I'm so excited about that work. And I'm not sure that work would have come together if it hadn't been part of these working groups and helping people see these things, because we both care about wanting to protect those communities and our work sort of touches it. But it was about bringing that work together and sanctioning it as part of their job. I think that, Robbie, is probably a big piece, is like that executive leadership support and being a coalition, like a change coalition, and really supporting the work and clearing, like the way that we talked about it is clearing the desk. So this can't be side of desk priority or side of desk nice to have. It has to be a center of desk priority. So how are you as their leader going to signal that this is part of their job now and actually something they can work on? And we had anticipated that perhaps there would still be a lot of coming along that would need to happen. But once you empower people and give them the tools and the time and the knowledge that this work is supported, I have been so just so pleased at how many people have taken up the cause and how it's unleashed their own inner activism and has allowed them to kind of create more work. So I think it's about just bringing people together to literally see themselves in the work. Like, here's how your work touches this, and then having their leadership say, and it's important, and I want you to do it, and it makes magic happen. It really does.
Great example. Thanks for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that's from Liz in Hamilton is around how we can help people see that financial stability is impossible without climate action. So also like another, related question around like how do we communicate the urgency of this locally? Maybe Julius or Brian, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can jump in here, and I think at least when I worked in municipalities, I was fortunate enough that we had a very humongous flood in 2013 and a humongous ice storm in 2013 as well, which put on the table that, financial stability is not on the table anymore. And also, within the context of when I was working in Mississauga, one of the things that we went through was that we had one year where we used 30,000 tons of salt, and the following year we used 90,000 tons of salt. And actually, one of the years I was working in Richmond Hill, municipalities were running out of salt. Luckily, we had a salt manager who had foreseen this coming and had ordered extra salt in November, but there were many municipalities that year that were having to prioritize what streets they were plowing and salting because they were literally running out of salt. And so when you're talking to a operational planning manager who's running the salt trucks, who's like, one year you have 30,000, one year you have 90,000, how are we going to deal with that? Like, that's a very concrete example of how you can have that conversation. And so I know there's in most municipalities, there are examples of either major things that have happened that have cost a lot of money that were not planned, or major fluctuations in planned stuff that can be used to be part of this conversation, particularly for operational folks, of like, how do you talk about the money? How do you talk about creating contingency budgets? How do you talk about what the financial landscape looks like in a climate situation? I think the other piece of it is if you haven't done a climate risk assessment, I would highly suggest doing one, because a lot of the things that come out as high risks, and there are things that come out as highly likely and highly catastrophic, but there are also things that are highly unlikely but are hugely catastrophic, that you need to plan for, that are things that you should be thinking about planning financially year over year, so that when that big thing does happen, one every 10 years, once every 50 years, you are financially prepared for it. Because when the ice storm happened in Mississauga, we spent $50 million on cleanup of trees alone. And so after that, it became very easy to have a financial conversation, because here's $50 million that we did not plan for that year. And $50 million is not an insignificant amount of money in terms of Mississauga's budget. And so finding those examples and using those examples as a way to talk about financial planning from a climate perspective, and showing that these things are not things that are going to happen in the future. They are already happening within your budgets, and if you don't plan for them, you're not being fiscally responsible. Is, to me, like, those conversations flow very easily once you show that kind of information.
Yeah.
I'm echoing
ahead, Brian.
Julius's. I'm echoing Julius. If you haven't done a climate risk assessment, you have no clue. Sorry, that's the thing. What we've done I've done climate risk assessments for medium-sized, small-sized municipalities. Yes, small-sized municipalities, the work can be done very easily and quickly. Embedding it into asset management. So this is my weird technical speak as a planner with municipalities. Asset management is one of the ones where it's like you have to look at the cost of those assets. Asset management used to be just about the age of an asset, but there's a big push internally with asset managers at international levels and national levels, and even in provinces, to say, no, climate change now needs to have that lens done on top of your assessment, so that you're not just looking at the age of the infrastructure, you're actually understanding the hazards, but not from a traditional, hey, the flood happens 1 in 100 years. That 1 in 100 year flood just happened. So what's the cost of that in terms of repairs? And I agree with Julia. It's like, I know so many municipalities that, I mean, sadly, our default response to a lot of the responses is like, when a disaster happens, that's when you know the financial cost, because we're used to being reactive versus to the proactive piece. But I think when you do the climate risk assessment, you start pushing that proactive piece to it, and it makes for an argument. The other two things I suggest is, if you're in a province that has I feel like we all have a carbon tax somewhere of some form currently, use that as your carbon price for emission reductions, and then look at the insurers out there and some of the groups that have done work. Look for the price of adaptation, because there is a dollar set value of, like, I think now it's like it used to be $1 of, I'm probably misquoting it. It used to be $1 put towards for its infrastructural adaptational work for climate risk. It used to be like $6. I think it's now up to $13 or $15. So the number goes up. And that's the other piece that I think people need to realize, is that we're so used economically to discount the future that it's like, we can't discount the future anymore. When it comes to our assets in our community, we need to put those pieces in. The difficulty is when you're trying to come up with costs for social and health factors. We attempted it. I attempted it in a municipality around a climate change action plan. We did our best from a health cost perspective, but it's very hard to get those kind. I mean, it's privacy data, so it's very hard to come up with an actual. Here's the number of people that have died because of a heart attack because of the heat wave. Although that's out there now, it's trying to put that cost value, and I think if we can crack that nut, you now have another level to put into this. But it's really, end of the day, if you have if you can talk to your finance department and they're interested in having that conversation, start simply by saying, hey, look at insurance rates, look at the risk of this sort of stuff, start thinking this in. And that's how I've started most of my conversations, is unless it's been required, I've kind of planted that seed in those informal network conversations, so that it gets up to them and they come out and go, hey, like, let's have a conversation about this, Brian.
Great. Thanks for those stories and examples. And there's quite a few resources being popped in the chat here as well related to this. So lots to check out if you're keen to dive deeper into this. There's, yeah, we're running out of time slowly. We have a few more minutes. There's a quick question for you, Julius, about an example you shared a little earlier on the call around bringing people together, and the event to bring people together, and a question whether that was organized by a consultant or city staff, and whether participants were from different departments within the city or also external partners.
Yeah, that example was it's all internal folks, because it was our corporate climate change framework that we were doing. And I ran that all myself because we had no funding to do that work. And I have some experience doing facilitating that kind of systems pathway action. You can actually if you go to the Richmond Hill's website, you can see the final results of the corporate climate change framework. You can see the results of that action planning that we did. And it was folks from all different departments. And so we brought them together really under themes, as opposed to bringing them together under departments, because this really was about what are the themes of action we need to take? What are the actions we need to take under those themes, like regardless of what department you were in? And then how do those actions actually work together, connect with each other? Like, how does one action help us do another action, to really bring folks to a place of like understanding how their actions are part of that pathway, as opposed to an action just being an action that stands alone. And so yeah, I think we ran like 5 or 6 different workshops with folks 2 or 3 times, just to kind of verify the information and build it together. And if you go to the Richmond Hill website, you can see the final. I see it's in the chat, so you can see the final results.
Wonderful. Perhaps I just want to do one final round for any final thoughts. Perhaps if you have a tangible piece of advice or a tactic that you'd like to leave with folks today on the call to get unstuck, or just any other reflection from the webinar, but really snappy, like 30 seconds each sort of thing, that would be wonderful. So anyone want to jump in first?
I can go first. I think a couple of things. One, I just saw a question in the chat about the influence of public pressure and how that impacts policy. And I will just say that nothing we still talk about it to this day, even though they still happen. They seem to be less and less attended, and it's probably as a result of them not seeing themselves in the work. But the school strikes for climate change in 2019 was one of the most impactful strikes that we had at City Hall. And I know, I was working for the mayor at the time, I know that that deeply influenced his awareness and understanding of our climate plan that was just being pitched at the time, and then subsequently was passed in 2020. So I can't underscore enough sort of the connection to youth and climate action. However, I also recognize that the burden of climate grief and feeling helpless rests a lot on their shoulders. And so I don't want to make it feel like that's their whole job. But I do know that those strikes are very impactful. They certainly work here in Halifax. So I would encourage more of that if and where capacity lends itself. And then I will just say that understanding behavior science and change management are really critical to climate action. So understanding what makes people think, what drives action, how people make decisions, this whole sort of, investing in the future versus making decisions right now is very clear in our national narrative around affordability and housing. And we can't even think about next year because I can't afford today. There's a lot of behavioral science that talks about that and how those two systems of thinking really influence each other. So if you've got people in your organizations that you have capacity for some training, get them trained in behavior science and get them trained in change management. Those things are really going to help tell the story about why it's important, which often becomes 50% of the work that we do as people who work in climate change, is just explaining why it's important to other people. And then one of the things that I think that we could have done a better job on here, and we're trying to think about now, is telling the story of climate change as it relates to affordability, housing, and healthcare. So it can't just always be climate change. If those are the focus areas, learn how to give your messaging related to how it ties in with that and how it can benefit those things.
Beautiful. Couple quick announcements. Jamie, a couple minutes ago, put in the chat, if you're leaving early, if you have to hop off, the quick feedback survey. Would love your feedback on this webinar. I just wanted to note that. Brian, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Natasha hit it kind of. So for us, one of our focuses is on don't focus just on climate action. So 2 pieces of advice. The first one I always go is co-benefits. So if it's not climate action, you change your message very quickly to health messaging, to transportation, to affordability housing one. We're definitely feeling that here, also here in BC. We're in the process of, there's a bit of an interesting pushback on affordability around zero carbon builds and all, but municipalities have shown that that costing is not as high as people, again, perception versus the reality of it. So we're hoping that rollout isn't going to get paused. Thankfully in Vancouver, it didn't at the moment, which is my second point. If whatever work you're doing, always be prepared to pivot. So I always tease people, at some point in time, if I ever retire from this field, I'm going to write the book that's called Subject to Change, because that's exactly what all this is. So be prepared to pivot. And that's why informal networks and allies are very beneficial, because they can help you understand where things might be going. But definitely the grassroots community connection will definitely to go. The wind has changed. Let's get aboard this now instead of trying to catch up.
Great final thought. Thanks, Brian. Julius, close us up.
Yeah, I'll build off of what the other 2 speakers said in terms of speaking about climate change without speaking about climate change. And when I got into this work, one of the biggest consultants actually was doing work in deep red parts of the US. That was where they were doing most of their work. And they were never talking about climate change, but they were doing some of the most innovative climate change work at the time. The other piece of the advice that I would give is know your procurement limits. We were able to do a lot of really amazing things under that limit of what you have to go out to the market for, and usually what you have to have approval for. And so that's the area where you can find really interesting, really innovative projects that will set the proof for others of what needs to be done, but you don't have to go through multiple levels of approval. You don't have to go out to the market and get 3 bids, et cetera, and you can try things out. And so knowing that limit and playing within that limit is a really key way of, and I can say this now that I'm not a part of a municipality, really key way of getting things done and trying new things at a speed that is allows you to try and quote unquote fail, but also allows you to prove the cases of things that you're trying to bring, you're trying to get that bigger amount of money for, you're trying to bring to hires up. So I'll end there.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here and sharing all your wisdom and insights and knowledge with everyone. And thank you to the participants for joining us today. You'll get everything in the follow-up email in terms of resources and recording and so on. And I put a link in the chat to the adaptive and resilient communities cohort that Tamarack is launching and accepting applications till tomorrow. So do check that out if you haven't already. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and rest of the week ahead.